My name is John M. Quaylen. I used to live here in Elgin some 80 years ago. I'll bet each and every one of you have a name as well. Some of you may have even changed your name for some reason or another. I know in my life I've had many names. In fact, John M. Quaylen is not even the name that you would find on my birth certificate. I was born Johann Mont Quaylen, spelled K-V-A-L-A-N. My father changed the spelling of our last name after I was born to Quaylen, Q-U-A-L-E-N. However, he still pronounced it Quaylen. His father, my grandfather, changed our family name from Olson to Quaylen. I should have known right then and there that many name changes would play an integral part in my life's sojourn. A sojourn that would find me here in Elgin for a good 3 years. So if you don't mind, let me take you back to the beginning and give you a little history of my life story. I was born in British Vancouver, Columbia, to Norwegian parents on the 8th day of December in 1899. My father was a lifelong minister of the Lutheran Church, and each and every time Dad would receive a calling to preach at a new location, my mother, brother, father, and I would pick up and move. We started out in Canada, we moved further south into Wisconsin, and then we moved to a small town in Illinois by the name of Aurora. From Aurora, in 1917, we moved northward to Elgin. You see, my dad had just received a new calling to become the minister of Zion Evangelical English Lutheran Church over on 330 Griswold in Elgin on the near west side, very close to Walnut Avenue. I, on the other hand, I was a high school student. I attended Elgin High, where I enjoyed very much playing flute in the orchestra and appeared in several class plays. In 1920, the class that I was in, senior class, voted me class president. I think I was somewhat popular in high school, not for the normal reasons, but for perhaps two unusual reasons. Number one, throughout most of my life, I spoke with a Norwegian accent that was slight but still discernible. Also, I was 3 years older than my contemporaries. This due to some less than standard schooling I had received as a youngster before I got to Elgin. However, when I got to Elgin, this all changed. I found the school here, the faculty, the administration, the student body, everything about my schooling experience in Elgin was second to none. In fact, this carried on with my English teacher. It was my English teacher that gave me an opportunity that really created my life's work. He had suggested that I attend an oration contest that was being held at Northwestern University in Chicago, which was going to be attended by all high school kids from a variety of states in the Midwest. Well, his enthusiasm and encouragement was so overwhelming that I decided to attend, but I did not want to go alone, so I grabbed a buddy of mine, a high school chum by the name of Earl Chopin, and Earl and I took off. See, Earl had a bit of a gift of gab, and I thought maybe he'd want to participate as well. So off we went, and we attended and we participated in this oration contest at Northwestern. After everyone's speeches were done and their readings were completed, the judges made their decision, and overall second place in the contest went to my friend Earl. We laughed and laughed. We didn't see that coming. That was wonderful. But at the end of the night, when they announced the winner of the contest, the gold medal title went to yours truly, John Quaylen. I was also offered a full scholarship to the Northwestern School of Drama. I almost decided to take up on that offer, but declined the solicitation because I was at a point in time in my life where I thought, well, maybe at the end of my high school career, maybe I should make a living. And it was at this very time that my parents received another calling, and we all moved out to Iowa to attend and become pastors at a church there. So while I was in Iowa for that short period of time, I met a young lady, a beautiful young lady by the name of Pearl. And please try to remember Pearl's name as we get back to her in a little bit. I was indecisive. I kept thinking to myself I should earn a living. But on the other hand, I won that contest. And I said to myself, well, maybe, just maybe, I could earn a living becoming an entertainer or an actor of some sort. So I decided to move back to Chicago, Illinois, and attend the Lyceum Arts Conservatory there. I met many wonderful and talented people, and while I was there, I met our coach, our drama coach, a gentleman by the name of Elijah Day. Mr. Day had a somewhat unique philosophy about using foreign accents and dialects. He thought that if we had any number of those in our repertoire, that maybe we could gain further employment. So he would say to us on more than one occasion, if you want to go out there and speak like an Italian, you got to go out there and you listen to the Italians. And the same is true with the German shoe and boot makers. And lad, you got to be knowing that there's an Irish cop on every corner in Chicago. Just go out and listen to him. So that's exactly what I did. I learned from absolutely anyone and everyone that I could. I even studied the elderly. I would listen to the way that they spoke, and I would get their movements down to a minor science. So what does one do with this accumulation of wealth and knowledge? Well, I don't know what most people would do, but I took it on the road. I grabbed two of my Lyceum friends, both females, and we started to tour the Chautauqua tent shows that were so very popular in the 1920s. We would go there and perform by singing or playing flute or violin or piano, and I would offer a 45-minute rendition of a dramatic reading. Now, we were working our way eastward from Chicago and eventually wound up in 1929 in New York. And while in New York, I tried to gain an appointment with a Broadway producer there by the name of Elmer Rice. Mr. Rice was in the process of putting together a play by the name of Street Scenes. And once I finally got that appointment with Mr. Rice, he told me, he says, John, you know, I've been looking all over New York for an actor that can use a Norwegian accent. My reply to him was, well, that's a coincidence. I've been looking all over New York for a play to be in. Bingo, I got the job. Street Scenes was staged and performed in New York for quite some time. So popular, in fact, it won a Pulitzer Prize. Elmer Rice decided he wanted to take his now award-winning play and turn it into a movie. Hollywood, here we come. This was my opportunity. My entire film career was now in front of me. So in 1931, we moved to Hollywood. We made the movie, of which I played the same role as I did on stage, a janitor, and Street Scenes was my very first movie in 1931. Now, I also went on to play any number of 120 different movie parts from that date until 1974. Perhaps you'll remember such movies as Casablanca or The Grapes of Wrath, or perhaps Knute Rockne, All-American. Each time I was cast for any movie, I was usually cast as the underdog, the downtrodden, the henpecked poor person, oftentimes from a foreign place. And because of that, I decided to use those accents that I learned from Mr. Day's encouragement. And that would lend more credence and believability to my characters. Now, in around 1951, not only was I doing movies in Hollywood, but I also decided to freelance and start doing some television shows as well. I have a list here of the television shows that I was in, and I'd like to read them to you. Since it was in 1951, perhaps maybe you'll remember these better than you would remember any of the 120 movies. The Ford Television Theater, Science Fiction Theater, 3 times on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Climax Mystery Theater, The Millionaire, December Bride, Cheyenne, Yancey Derringer, The Californians, Tightrope, Bronco, The Alaskans, Twice on the Gale Storm Show, Overland Trail, Sugarfoot, Sea Hunt, Klondike, Boris Karloff's Thriller, The Barbara Stanwyck Show, Bonanza, Maverick, The Andy Griffith Show, Lawman 3 times, Laramie, The Wide Country, The Third Man, The Real McCoys, My Favorite Martian, Make Room for Daddy, The Virginians, No Time for Sergeant, Dr. Kildare, Ben Casey, Sally and Sam, 3 times on Mr. Ed, and no, I did not play the horse. The Donna Reed Show, Burke's Law, Jericho, Shane, The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., I Spy, Doc, Twice on Green Acres, Medical Center, Getting Away from It All, The Partridge Family, Wednesday Night Out, 3 times on The Odd Couple, The Street of San Francisco, and my last television my last television program was in 1974, aptly entitled Moving On. Now, the last group that was here asked me, they said, John, with all of those actresses and actors that you worked with, all very famous in their day and some not so famous, who was, in fact, your favorite leading lady? Well, you would think after a 5-decade career that would be a very difficult question to answer, but for me it was not. Do you remember Pearl, the girl that I met in Iowa? Well, we married, and she was my leading lady for almost 60 years. And we had 3 beautiful daughters, Meredith, Elizabeth, and Kathleen. Now let's jump forward to the end of my career as I've made all of these movies and all of these television shows. I'm now 77 years old, and my eyesight is failing me very rapidly. It was very difficult and challenging to continue to be an actor as much as I wanted to be. So at the age of 77, I retired from acting, and 11 years later, in 1987, at the age of 88, I quietly slipped away from life's stage. I was buried at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale, California, passing away on the 12th day of September, 1987. It is written that I passed away due to heart failure, but never once did my heart ever fail for this great town we call Elgin. You see, of all of the places that I lived and called home, and there were many, Elgin was my true home. I had friends here. I went to school here. Things of importance seemed to happen in Elgin. I visited Elgin many times in my life. The last time I had visited Elgin was in 1970 to attend my 50th class reunion at Elgin High School. And lo and behold, who should I find there on that visit but my old friend, Earl Chopin. Second place Earl, now circuit court judge. So I can see that I've probably bent your ear long enough, and it's a beautiful day and you've got other people to visit. So I just wanted to say thank you for stopping by and ask you, as you traverse the cemetery today, listen to see and if you can confirm the rumor that I just heard. Apparently Hollywood is in the process of casting a new movie. It is a remake from a classic that you might know called Heaven Can Wait. I believe it had, what was that actress, that blonde actress in there? Goldie Hawn. Although the remake is now going to be entitled Heaven Can't Wait, and apparently few others can as well. So I thank you for your time and ask you all very quietly and nicely to exit stage left. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. Here lies Gilbert Benton Snow, brilliant businessman and inventor, father and husband, upstanding as Elgin resident. But we'll talk about Gilbert later because he was my second husband. I am May Hunter Yarwood Snow. I'm also buried here at this cemetery, but I reside in Lot 8, Section 15. I moved to Elgin at a very young age, though my father was a pioneer Texan and a member of the Texas legislature. Because of the Texas unrest at the time of my birth, 1861, he sent my pregnant mother to Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was born there February 26th, and our family reunited here in the Fox Valley. Mother, father, my brother William, and I. William was actually one of Elgin's first postmasters. I grew up here in Elgin, attending Elgin schools, and I graduated from the Elgin Academy in 1879. It was at the Academy that I met my first husband, Willard Yarwood. Willard played the snare drum in the band, he volunteered at the library, and he worked in the escape department at the Elgin Watch Factory. We were married in a small ceremony, December 1881 at my parents' home, and moved immediately to Atlanta, Georgia, where Willard was part of the jewelry business. After Atlanta, we spent time in the Dakotas, as well as Alabama for Willard's business. During that time, we had two beautiful children, Marguerite and Bertram. And during that time, my husband Willard's health also began to fail, though it seemed to be improving when we came to visit family here in August of 1890. My poor husband went for a ride one afternoon and was seized with such a severe coughing fit that he burst a blood vessel and died instantly. I decided that it would be a good choice for my family to remain here, close to family and friends and the place where I had grown up. 1 year later, in 1891, this man, Gilbert Snow, moved to Elgin. Gilbert was born and raised in Sugar Grove, and he had spent the last 7 years in Chicago as a farm implements expert for the Deering Harvester Company. While Gilbert worked in Chicago, a small Elgin windmill company suffered a devastating fire in 1887. They decided to sell their patents to the newly formed Elgin Wind Power and Pump Company under the leadership of George Peck. Mr. Peck needed a plant manager for his new windmill company, and Gilbert came to take that position. Gilbert and I met and married in 1893. We got married in Chicago on a Tuesday, and I took to taking care of the children, my two, Marguerite and Bertram, with my first husband, and our new baby daughter. Her name was Ruth. Gilbert, on the other hand, became to develop a keen sense of business, finances, as well as creativity and a lot of invention to do with windmills. My husband helped the company double its profits from 25 to 50 windmills produced and shipped every week. The Elgin Windmill Power and Pump Company produced windmills that were 14, 16, and 20 feet in diameter, with 5 different types of pumping mills and galvanized steel blades to replace the traditional wooden ones. Gilbert himself invented a self-oiling machine. It was used on this model, the Wonder, in 1906. This kind of machine provided that the windmill only needed an oil change once a year, as opposed to the poor person who had owned the windmill making a hazardous climb once a week. This, of course, led to the company's increase in profits, as did a windmill like the one featured in the advertisement, the Centennial. The Centennial was a vaneless windmill, which made it perfect to fit into small spaces, like between buildings or up on a high hill where the wind was unsteady. Other names of windmill models were the Whiz, the Flying Dutchman, the Lady Elgin, the Swede, and the Mogul. The company was doing so well that they needed to move from their plant on River Street to 79 North State Street. That building still stands today and is currently a salvage and antique shop. Our family also relocated to Chicago Street, 400 Chicago Street, a brick residence that still stands at the intersection of Chicago and Gifford. I'm told that today Deborah Allen and her family live in that home. My husband did so well in business because he was persistent and he was strong. For instance, in 1910, he wanted to put some weighing scales in the sidewalk in front of our property. He got some guff and some anger from the merchants on either side of him. They were very angry, particularly the Ziegler brothers who were next door. When Gilbert put in a petition, they put in a counter petition, and for many months it was mired in red tape at the Elgin City Council. Well, finally, Gilbert got so mad that he went down in the middle of the night, the dead of winter, January, at 3 o'clock, and oversaw the installing of the scales. You should have seen the faces of the Ziegler brothers when they arrived at work the next day. They were livid. There were articles in the newspaper. They even issued a warrant for my husband's arrest. Of course, he did not get arrested, though he was served the warrant. My husband did very well with the Elgin Windmill Power and Pump Company. He was both secretary and treasurer on their board for over 25 years, and at the time of his death, he owned most of their stock. My husband Gilbert, however, did not do very well with his health. As he reached his early 60s, his health failed so greatly that he decided to try a trip south. He spent Christmas in 1918 in Texas, and then decided to go to Florida, where I was to meet him in early 1919. In January 11th, as he traveled by train to Miami, he suffered a heart attack and became very ill. He had to go to the hospital and where he died later that morning. I did not marry again after my husband's death, though I did take his space on the Elgin Windmill Company board. The Elgin Windmill Company had 10 more profitable years. Our last profitable year was 1929, when we produced about 1,600 windmills that year. During the event of the Depression, however, business failed. Even 3 years later, in 1932, we produced less than 300 windmills, and the company had been sold by 1943. After my husband's death, I served on the board. I also was part of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, the Elgin Women's Council, and I was active with the First Congregational Church, which I attended. I lived to be 94 years old. I turned 94 on February 22nd, 1955, Washington's birthday, and at that time I was the oldest living alum of the Elgin Academy. I died a few months later, May 20th, 1955. I lived for 94 years, 85 of them here in Elgin. During that time, I was married to this man for 26 years. Every time I feel the wind on my face, I think of my husband, Gilbert Snow. Thank you.
Welcome, and I thought I would never say this being an Elgin saloon keeper, but I'm certainly glad Elgin's dry today. As you see in your booklets, my name is Nicholas Goddard, and I was known as the most honest saloon keeper in Elgin. Of course, that's not saying much. That's like saying you're the most honest politician in Chicago. You didn't have to do much to get that title. I was born in Belgium in 1853. And I moved to the United States, ended up in Ohio in 1871, and I ended up in Chicago in 1875. In Chicago, I was at a train station. I took most of my cash, I brought it to the ticket master, and I said, I just want to go 40 miles from Chicago. And the next thing I know, I'm in Elgin, and that's where I would spend the next 47 years of my life. When I moved to Elgin, I worked on a farm out east town, Miller's Farm. And then I moved in the city, and I worked as a bartender at the Center Hotel, which became the Elgin Hotel, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed being a bartender. But I didn't like the way the saloons treated their customers. I saw the saloons treating the customers as sheep, just waiting to be fleeced, to get that last dollar, that last cent from those people. And I vowed that when I had my own bar, I would do that. I would not do that. I would follow my rules. I would follow the law of the letter of the law. So I opened my own bar in 1884 in the Shaw Hotel. I put up my sign, Nicholas Goddard, and there I'd stay for the next 30 years. Now my bar was not your average bar. It was more of a social gathering place. I had the same bartenders for most of the years, 25 years. I wouldn't ever sell alcohol to an intoxicated person. One time I had a young man come in. He says, he wants another pint of whiskey. And I could see he was clearly drunk, and I refused to sell it to him. He insisted, and instead of saying anything else, I just turned around, locked the bar, and went home. I closed the rest of the night rather than have to deal with that issue. I had no gambling devices, because after a few beers, you tend to throw money away. I didn't want money that way. That was wrong. That was wrong to take money from people who would, go to get a drink, and the next thing they know, they have nothing left. I didn't want children coming down to the bar looking for their dads to bring them home for dinner. I gave away no free lunches. I didn't want you there from morning to night. I wanted you to come in, maybe have a drink or two, talk, laugh, and go home. I didn't want to overserve you. I didn't want you fighting in the bars. I didn't want you leaving my bar and hurting someone or hurting yourself. I would not be open, even if it wasn't the law. I would never be open on a Sunday. Most of my customers, they're working 6 days a week. That seventh day should not be in a bar with me. It should be at their church, with their family. It should be with their people that they love. They shouldn't be in a bar with me. You can love me by that much. And that's what I wanted to do. During this time, I had become a respectable businessman. I had a wife. I had married her in 1883. I had 4 children. I was seen as a respectable businessman in the city of Elgin. And for a saloon keeper to be seen as respectable was quite a trick. My fellow saloon keepers, they weren't as far-seeing as I was. I had known that this has been an issue in Elgin for a long time between dry and wet. Since the inception of the city, it's always been a question, should alcohol be served in Elgin? Now, I don't want to surprise any of you, but Elgin's always been fairly conservative. Now, it seems like a shock to some of you, I know. But this dry versus wet question had been building momentum for years. And it came to a head in 1891 when William Grote was running against a man named Arwin Price. They could not be more clearly defined. William Grote was a dry. Arwin Price was as wet as you could be. He wasn't just wet at home, he was wet in public. He had no problems drinking in public, and he was a good old boy who just would drink and had often become the show himself. People loved him or they hated him, but he definitely was the dry. He was the ultimate wet, and Grote was the ultimate dry. It was sobriety versus whiskey, order versus disorder, home versus a saloon. And surprisingly, William Grote, the dry candidate, won. The tide was starting to turn. People were tired of the saloons causing all the problems in town. Men going in, getting into fights. The police were always having to be there. Families were being destroyed by these people drinking away their paychecks. The children would have nothing to eat the rest of the week because the check was gone. I saw this as a moderation, that if the bars and the saloons had been run in moderation, you had this self-responsibility and you took care of yourself, that they could have coexisted, the wets and the dries, but that was not happening. And in 1908, 1910, 1912, referendums were tried to be passed in Elgin to make the city dry. And the saloon keepers thought it's never going to happen. They have always won. Their margins were getting smaller, but they had always won. They were going to stay wet. Except in 1914, they forgot to realize one thing was going to happen. Women got to vote in the referendum. And you know what that means. The smarter sex decided to make the city dry. So on May 7th, 1914, 6 years before the country would have prohibition, Elgin was a dry town. And I saw the problem with that is that alcohol would always be there. You can go to outer counter areas, you can go into unincorporated, there's always going to be alcohol. I tried to convince my fellow saloon keepers that if we moderated, we could stay in business, but it didn't work out that way. The city was dry and these saloons were out of business. And this was a big blow to the city because you had 25% of your revenue for the city came for liquor license. There were cutbacks because the saloons were closing. But others said that the city would be a safer, more family place to be. So on May 7th, 1914, the bars are closing. And it was kind of a microcosm of what would happen because on that night, the streets were filled with young men, 2-3 deep in the street, and they vowed to take a drink at every last of the 34 bars. So you had a rolling party, and the Wets even admitted at a point, this is a little out of control. So on that night, the time came, I locked my bar, and I went home, never to open my bar again. And I would live at home for a few more years, and I would die in 1917 in my sleep over my house in Dundee. And I know it's not a good way to judge if you're popular or how much you're respected by the size of your funeral, but my funeral was huge. It was one of the biggest funerals St. Joe's had ever seen. I'd been a member there for years. I donated the stained glass, and I'd been a respectable, upright citizen and a member of that church. And everybody at my funeral would talk about how responsible I was, how honest I was, how Nick's was a good place to go. Nick was a good guy. Now today and on this walk, you'll see some politicians and some businessmen, and you'll see wealth and power. But if my legacy is known as the last honest saloon keeper in Elgin, I'm happy with that. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Adler Clothing. Welcome to Adler Clothing Store. Hello, hello. May I help you with... Oh, am I saying what I think I'm saying? Forgive me, I realize this is not Adler Clothing. I'm so sorry. It's just that I'm so used to saying that. I believe I must have said that same thing to every customer who walked into my store for 38 years. I am Leopold Adler. You may call me Leo. I'm an immigrant from Germany. In the small town the village where I grew up in Germany, there was another town, Bienaubaden, just up the river. And in Bienaubaden there was a very special young girl, Rosie Schwerman. Now I called on Rosie, but I think because mainly of the distances between our villages and also because of perhaps the young ages we were at the time, it really never went anywhere. And I have to admit to you that as well, I was interested in other things beside Rosie at the time. You see, like all of the young men my age in all of the small villages in Germany, we were thinking of one thing, and that is booking passage to the land of opportunity and social justice, America. Well, I was no different. And so, in 1850, I arrived here at the age of 16. Now, you know, like almost all of the German Jews of my era, I worked in the clothing industry. It was the trade we knew. We learned it from our family, we learned it from our friends, and for the first 8 years here, I worked hard as a single man. I saved my money, I learned the business, and every day I thought, what happened to Rosie? So I wrote the question in a letter and I sent it back to Germany, and my uncle responded, well, Rosie went to America too. Well, where? I said, did she go? Muscatine, Iowa, he said. Muscatine, Iowa. Muscatine, Iowa, that's not so far to travel for a good reason. And the reason was what I had been holding in my heart for her all these years. So what did I do? Well, I went to Muscatine, Iowa, and I found her, and I courted her. In 1859, Rosie and I were married in a double wedding ceremony. Rosie, me, her brother Abraham, and his new wife. Well, Rosie and I did return to Elgin, and this, of course, is where we spent the rest of our lives together. We did have a clothing business on Douglas Avenue, and then further up on Douglas, we lived in our home and we raised our family there. In the beginning, business was not so good. But as Elgin grew, the business grew, and then the war between the states gave us an opportunity to make uniforms for the Illinois Volunteers. That kept us busy 24 hours a day. And of course, after that, business was wonderful and has continued to be so. Rosie had a belief, and her belief was that you must give your children the best education. Specifically, she believed in a good musical education. And so all 7 of our children were accomplished pianists. One, however, stood out. That was our son Max. You see, Max was so gifted that by the time he was 18 years old, Rosie and I sent him to Berlin, Germany to study at the Königliche Academy, and there he studied classical violin. 4 years later, he was back in America giving concerts all over the country and becoming very well known. Then he became the business manager for that group that he was playing with. After that, he decided to enter into the musical instrument business in the city of Chicago. You know, they say, whoever they are, they say that the reason you work so hard to educate your children is so that they themselves don't have to put the long hours and work the hard work that you yourself had to. Isn't that what they say? They say. Well, if what they say is right, then Rosie and I succeeded wonderfully, you know, because of the 7 children that we had, not one wanted anything to do with the family business. What can you do? Well, Rosie has passed on, God rest her soul, in 1905. I myself am now retired, and I'm living in Chicago with my daughters, Lois and Hattie. And that reminds me, that I believe I must be going soon to catch the 3:45 train to Chicago, that is. One thing I would like to mention to you is that Max, yes, he was outstanding. Musical ability, yes. But business ability, haha, yes, yes, yes. 3 times yes. You see, let me explain that. Max was given an opportunity in 1897 to go into business with Julius Rosenwald, his brother-in-law. He was given the position of chief musical instrument manager and chief buyer for a new mail order business that they were starting. It was called Sears Roebuck and Company. Now I predict that the Sears Roebuck and Company and my son Max will be very successful.
Leopold Adler did not live to see his son Max's greatest contributions, and we know that he would want you all to know that Max Adler was very successful with his employer Sears Roebuck and Company. By 1921 he had become an officer, a director, and a substantial shareholder. After he retired in 1928, Max Adler used part of his fortune to donate the first planetarium in the Western Hemisphere to Chicago, also known as Adler Planetarium in downtown Chicago.
Good afternoon. My name is Adoniram Judson Jocelyn. Those of you who live in Elgin should be familiar with my middle name, Judson, because I was named after one of the leading missionaries in Asia in the 19th century, Adoniram Judson. The college over on the west side is named after Adoniram Judson. And because, of course, he was a Baptist missionary who wrote a dictionary of the Burmese and English languages. My family came into McHenry County in 1838. In 1844, I arrived in Elgin to become the second pastor of the Baptist Church, and was the pastor for about 11 years. During that time, we erected the Cobblestone Church, located on the corner of DuPage and Geneva Street, about where the Franklin School is located now. But more important, to me at least, in 1846, the Baptists in Elgin passed a resolution saying they had an increased desire that licentiousness, intoxication, and slavery were among the things that were and are not. In 1845, I helped to establish Elgin's first newspaper, the Western Christian, which opposed the black laws, statutes which prevented people from bringing any blacks into the state of Illinois. In 1848, I was active in the Liberty Party, or Free Soil Party. Here in Elgin, the Liberty Party defeated the Democrats and the Whigs, and our candidate for president was Martin Van Buren, but he did not win. In 1852, I myself was a candidate for representative to Congress on the Liberty Party or Free Soil ticket. In 1854, I was the organizing secretary for the Republican Party in King County. I suppose I did as much political work as Baptist work, but I felt that the two were really the same, because it was a holy cause eliminating slavery in our society. In 1855, I left Elgin to become the pastor of the Union Park Baptist Church in Chicago. In fact, I helped to organize that church. And in the next 4 years, I helped to organize the Baptist University of Chicago with Stephen A. Douglas as chairman of the board of directors, on which I served. That little Baptist college in Chicago was the predecessor of the University of Chicago, which was established in 1891. I returned to Elgin in 1860 as editor of the Weekly Gazette newspaper. In that newspaper, I promoted the candidacy of Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States and was opponent, of course, of slavery. In 1862, I was elected a delegate to a constitutional convention in Springfield to draw up a new constitution for the state of Illinois. I was one of only 7 to propose that the black laws be repealed and that Negroes be allowed to be citizens and given the right to vote. Those 2 provisions were overwhelmingly approved not only by the convention but by the voters of the state of Illinois, although the Constitution itself was defeated. So you can see what a small minority I was a member of. In 1862, while I was editor of the paper, I received a letter from Pastor Thomas of the First Baptist Church, who was serving as chaplain of the 52nd Illinois. After the Battle of Shiloh, the Union Army controlled much of northern Alabama. And Pastor Thomas wrote to me that slaves were escaping from the plantations in the Tennessee Valley and coming behind the Union lines. And the Union Army had no means of taking care of them. By the way, I might mention that many slaves freed themselves this way long before the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted or put into force. And so Pastor Thomas said, "Can you take them here in Elgin?" And I said, "Yes, send them north." This is very unusual because Aurora said no, Rockford said no, Freeport said no. We were among the few students, among the few communities to accept them. And so 110 refugees arrived from the camps in northern Alabama, most of them women and children. And it was a hard time for them and for Elgin because many of them had been infected with scarlet fever and smallpox and diphtheria on their way north. In a matter of months, the children began attending the schools in Elgin. My brother, whose tombstone is over there, Edwin Swain Jocelyn, and I differed on almost everything. I was a Republican, he was a Democrat. I opposed the Demon Rum and the saloon, and he was an obituary of the Horse and Jockey Tavern on South Gould Avenue. And he naturally opposed blacks coming up here. And in 1864, when I was promoting a temperance drive here in Elgin, he was one of those who opposed it. He also opposed blacks coming into the schools. And I said to him and to the people of Elgin, it takes someone who was a good judge of skin color to determine whether the lightest darky was darker than the darkest whitey. And he won, of course. We didn't get an integrated school system here in Elgin until 1872. From beginning in 1863, I helped to establish a so-called colored school on Center Street. In 1866, I withdrew from the First Baptist Church and helped the black freedmen, as they were known as, or the contrabands, organize a church of their own known as the Second Baptist Church. All my life, I stood for equal rights for all people. Other things being equal, I favored the rich against the poor, the weak against the strong, and the ignorant against the cunning and the crafty. As you leave me, remember that we are all sons and daughters of Abraham and brothers and sisters of Christ. Thank you for coming.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Cyrus Wilbur. I'm not a native of Elgin, but I did consider it to be my home for most of my life. I was actually born in Buffalo in 1853. My father was a fairly well-known architect and home builder in the Buffalo area. And when I was a year old, he decided to move the entire family to the Elgin area. Elgin at the time, the mid 1850s, was a boomtown, taking advantage of the beginning of the westward expansion. Elgin was one of the largest communities west of Chicago. So I grew up here in Elgin. I went to grade school, went to public high school here. As the youngest of 6 kids, I really didn't have much of a family legacy to inherit, and so my father had to figure out what to do with me. Considering he was upper middle class as an architect, he had the means, and he was a realtor, and he decided that it would be useful to have a lawyer in the family. So he sent me to Ann Arbor, Michigan to law school. Went there in 1872, graduated law school in 1874, came back to Elgin, joined a law firm, and worked towards my bar, and passed the Illinois State Bar in the beginning of 1875. Unfortunately, I really didn't like being a lawyer. I traveled a lot in my life. Traveled to Michigan to visit family, traveled to Chicago, traveled to Ann Arbor, back and forth to college. And I really didn't want to be stuck in a stuffy office all my life, surrounded by books and paper and ink and must and that sort of thing. So I was only a lawyer for a year, gave that up and tried to figure out what else I was going to do in my life. Taught middle school here in Elgin for a year, didn't like that. Because I had a college degree, which was fairly rare in the 1870s, I ended up as the editor of the Elgin Daily News. But I didn't like that either. Teaching and being a lawyer, being a newspaper editor, I'm still inside all day. So I gave that up, and I sat around and thought, well, what do I want to do with my life? And I decided that I really like to travel. And in the 1870s, in fact, through most of the 1800s and into the 1900s, there was only one way to travel. That was by rail. The railroads were the only way to move around. We as Americans, as 21st century Americans, think, oh, well, what about cowboys? Everybody running around the prairies on horseback. It's all Hollywood myth. There were cowboys, there were people west of the Mississippi with horses. East of the Mississippi, owning a horse was the equivalent of owning a Ferrari. And quick poll, how many people here own a Ferrari? Yeah, you would not own a horse. If you don't have a horse, how do you get around from place to place? If you're walking, people jog 5 miles every day. Yeah, try that in leather shoes on no roads. Humans walk 5 miles a day. Military marches 15 miles a day. If you're on a horse, which none of us can afford, we can do 20 miles a day. Ooh, we can't get anywhere. Before the advent of the railroads, most human beings had never gone more than 5 miles from their place of birth, ever. Unless you were in an army ransacking another country. That was it. It did not happen. So railroads were cool. They gave you the ability to travel, and travel equals freedom and liberty and of a sort. And at the time, railroads were booming. After the Civil War, railroads were growing at an astronomical rate. By the time I joined a railroad company in 1877, that same year, 19,000 miles of rail were laid in this country. Can you imagine Illinois Department of, Illinois, IDOT, trying to lay 19,000 miles of highway? They can't even get one right. So I went to Chicago, which was the rail hub of the world, still is, and I decided to work for the Lake Transportation Company. Lake Transportation Company at the time was sort of the 19th century version of Halliburton, in that what they did was subcontract services out to railroads. There were a lot of railroads running around in the United States, but most of them were very small. If they crossed a single state line, they were considered a large carrier. Because railroads were fairly small, they couldn't afford middle management positions. So they would go to Lake and subcontract the services. I started off here in Elgin, subcontracted to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, which is now our Metro line, working as the regional passenger agent. Did fairly well there. Went back to Lake. Worked for the Union Pacific Railroad on the Transcontinental Railway system as a roving passenger agent, solving problems, fixing issues, that sort of thing. That gave me more of an opportunity to travel. In fact, I got to travel to California and Texas, which nobody ever did. Did that for a few years, went back to Lake. They were building a transcontinental railroad system in the late 1870s, early 1880s in Canada. And I was contracted with the Canadian Pacific Railroad as the chief buyer. I would stay in Chicago, which was a major industrial center, buy material for the Canadian Transcons and ship it to Canada to be laid through the Rocky Mountains. And I was fairly well respected in the railroad communities. Most railroad management knew who I was. They knew how reliable I was. They thought of me as a fairly reliable and steady middle manager type. And in 1883, Cornelius Vanderbilt approached me to work for his railroad empire, specifically for the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern as the Chicago passenger agent. And a job I was glad to jump on. Cornelius Vanderbilt built the first large railroad monopoly in the country, stretching from New England through and across the Mississippi River. I worked for the Lakeshore Michigan Southern, which went from about Buffalo to Chicago, and it was the hub of that rail empire. Working as a senior passenger agent doesn't sound all that exciting. Sell them tickets, get them out of my way. That's not really what the case is. Since railroads are the only way to move anything in the country, I was a go-between between the rail customers and senior management, trying to get, specifically in my case, passengers from place to place. The Lakeshore and Michigan Southern at the time was running 30 trains each direction between Buffalo and Chicago. Who goes to Buffalo? Why was there so much traffic? You don't get 30 flights from O'Hare to Buffalo every day. You get 2 maybe. You take a look on the map, you see this nice little arc along the Great Lakes. That arc between Chicago and Buffalo was the economic powerhouse on the planet. Just that one area in the United States was cranking out more capital, industry, economics, money, essentially, than England and Germany combined. And when you talk to most historians and economists about industrial power in the 1800s, they talk about England for its import-export in wool, and they talk about German Krupp steel. That chunk of the United States is cranking out more than both those countries combined. And I was in charge of the western hub of moving people around. And I did fairly well. I started climbing up the corporate ladder, became Western Regional Traffic Director in the mid-1880s. Which basically gave me everything from Ohio to Illinois as my zone of control. And then by 1896, I became the overall traffic director of the entire Vanderbilt rail system. I would have gone further up the corporate ladder, but unfortunately 2 years later, I died of a massive heart attack at the age of 45. Which wasn't uncommon. Men usually didn't live that long. Before about 1960. You notice I have a baseball bat here. Why do I have a baseball bat? It's not to whack an occasional unruly passenger. When I was in high school, I started playing baseball. Baseball was fun. Baseball was exciting. Baseball was the game to play in the United States. After the Civil War, bored soldiers played a lot of baseball. They brought it home with them. That's when baseball became really popular. In the late 1860s through the 1870s and 1880s, it was a huge growth sport. It was very unorganized. It wasn't nearly as corporate and commercialized as it is today. But I played baseball in high school, played baseball in Ann Arbor. When I came back to Elgin in 1875, when I should have been studying law and trying to pass my bar, was actually on the Elgin Bluff City, which was an informal league team, basically like a softball league is today. Bunch of guys get off of work, go knock some balls around, drink some beers, gamble. And that's what most baseball was. It was very informal, very fun, and very dynamic. And I was pretty good at it. I was a second baseman. We won our regionals. We beat Sycamore, Belvedere, Byron. We were so good, in fact, that in October of 1875, the Chicago White Stockings invited us to play an exhibition game in Chicago against them. We promptly lost to them 33-9, as they were a real live professional team. But we still did fairly well. And we went on later that month to beat Bloomington for the state championships and come home with $200 apiece in our pocket, which isn't bad considering the usual day labor rate was about a quarter. So that's essentially me. My professional life was fairly well involved with railroads, but I would have been a lawyer if it wasn't for the fact that I like to play baseball. Any questions? Well, thank you for coming out.
Hello everyone, my name is Nellie Mann Chappelle, and I'm the daughter of a pioneer family here in Elgin. My father, Sylvester, and my mother is Caroline, and I was born on March 27th, 1863. Now my father was a pretty prominent man here in town and quite wealthy. He served a 3-year term as a state legislator. He had a dairy business as well as being a livestock breeder. He had farms in both Hampshire and Burlington, and he also had quite a bit of livestock here on the east side of Elgin, behind a home on Division Street. In fact, there is one cow that gave him some recognition from that area, and that cow was pictured in the Breeders' Gazette of 1884 because it delivered 51.5 pounds of milk in a single day. I wonder what my dad was feeding her. After several years, he retired and sold the farms both in Hampshire and Burlington, and they settled into a small home on the east side of town here on Division Street. I'm sorry, on Chicago Street. When I was 22, my father passed away, and the funeral was held in their home. And it was about this time that I became enamored with Ora A. Chappelle, and he was a new young businessman here in town. He was very energetic, very intelligent. He was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied dental surgery, and then he came back and studied again in Chicago at Rush and received his license of MD. He began his practice. His first office was at the Elgin National Bank, and after we courted for about a year, we were married in my folks' home. It's a shame that my father wasn't here to witness that, as my mother was very proud. We had about a 3.5-month honeymoon that began up in Michigan at our summer home. And during that period, we traveled through Wisconsin and Michigan, and we visited with various members of both my side of the family and his. And when we returned back to Elgin, we moved into our beautiful little apartment at the Lillian. Ora, as a wedding gift, had completely furnished it for me prior to our wedding. That was a good idea. Soon after, I delivered our first son, named after my husband, and before long, I became the mother of 2 little boys. Our second son's name was Rollo. As our family grew, we moved from our flat at the Lillian over to a small home on Chicago Street, and eventually we purchased our beautiful home at 117 Tennyson Court. Before long, our boys became men, and both of the boys decided to follow in their father's footsteps and become dentists, so away they went to college. And it was about this time, when I found myself home in this big house alone, that I realized it was time to make a change. I had, on the surface, shown myself to be a happy mother and wife, when in reality there was no love in our marriage. I was very unhappy. My closest friends and family members knew of this, but none of our friends in our social circles here in town were aware of it. And so when I went and filed a suit against my husband, it caused great sensation here in town. It was all over the newspapers. It was a very difficult time for me and for Ora with his practice, and to have to live with the scandalous reports that were showing up every day in the newspapers and the chatter behind my back as I would go into town. We put up with this for several months, and on October 1st, I said, "This is enough," and I left. I mean, I just left. I didn't tell anyone where I went, and I never thought I would hurt my sisters or my mother by not telling them. I assumed they realized I was distraught over the loss of my marriage, and that I just needed time alone. But what happened was the newspapers sensationalized the reports stating that I had possibly been institutionalized for an emotional breakdown, and it had my mother and sisters very worried. Now, this was in October. By December, my sisters had located me. I was out in Boise, Idaho, staying with friends, and I received 2 telegrams just days before Christmas. One was from my sisters, requesting that I come home and letting me know that they missed me and were concerned about my health. The second one was from Ora, who had wished that I would come back and try to rebuild our marriage. And so, at his request, I agreed, but I told him I would not come back to Elgin. He could meet me in Chicago, and so that he did. And on December 28th, we left directly from Chicago to Tampa, Florida, to work on reconciling our marriage. A month later, we came back to Elgin, and we were all over the newspapers again. Unfortunately, the differences that we had, both financial over our eldest son, there were just so many differences that we had, we could not resolve. And so we formally separated in January of '09. And Ora moved away. And after me being in the home for a month by myself, I decided to go back to Boise, where I stayed for over a year. Now, it was at this time that there were reports that I did suffer an emotional and physical breakdown. It was a very sorrowful time for me, and we were unable to resolve our differences, so I went ahead and filed a suit in Boise. I came back to Elgin at my son's request. The youngest son, Rolo, came out to visit me and to make sure I was okay, along with my niece, who was also from Elgin. They brought me back to Elgin, where I stayed at a friend's home for a while, and finally, in 1911, the battle was over. After 3 long, struggling years, our marriage was dissolved, and I thought that it was the end and a beginning of being a new single woman. Unfortunately, the battle had not ended because my ex-husband chose to remarry 3 months later, which outraged me that he would do that so soon. So I was very angry. His new bride was Allie Best, who was from St. Charles. She was the wealthy widow of Morrow the magician, and even though she was quoted as being the most beautiful woman in all of Kane County, I'm sure it had something to do with her flitting about on stage, helping him with his magic tricks. You know, I was so angry over this. I was just outraged. So you know what I did? I sued her for $30,000 because she alienated the passion and the love that my husband had for me. Of course, my ex-husband was outraged with this whole thing, and he contested that suit. Now, as the years progressed, 4 years later, my health declined. I did pass away at 516 East Chicago Street in the home of some friends, the Potters, who were caring for me. It's just a shame that I couldn't have hung on there for another 5 years, because if I did, I would have been there to witness when Mrs. Allie Best Chappelle served him divorce papers. Thank you.
Thank you. You're great.
Thanks.